All right, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Arthur. I'm a member of the Emergency Committee for Rojava. I want to thank everybody for joining us today and welcome you all into this space. Very excited to see so many faces and names and profile pics. We see some familiar ones and some not so familiar ones, so that's always a great combination. The theme of today's event, as you probably already know, is updates. There's been a lot of news coming in, most recently about the visit to the White House by Ahmed al-Shara, the new president of Syria. And a lot of folks are wondering what's going on the ground in Syria these days. What's the current status of the Rojava revolution? And so we thought it was time yet again to kind of have an event to bring people up to speed, answer folks' questions, and kind of give a sense of what is going on and what the kind of current political process might mean for the future of the Rojava Revolution. To do that, I'm happy to say we have been graciously joined by our friend Meghan Bodette of the Kurdish Peace Institute, who, by the way, is joining us today from Kamishlo in northeast Syria. Meghan, thank you so much for joining us and making the time.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what we're going to do, just to give people kind of general overview, we're going to hear from Megan, a bit of a short presentation of just kind of key highlights of things that have been happening recently and the different kind of political processes that are ongoing. But then, as I said, we're going to go ahead and open things up. So we will accept questions from participants. So if you're listening in, you hear what Megan has to say, you still got questions, that's fantastic. Go ahead and write your questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to kind of get to all of them later on in the program. And we'll also be sharing some updates about the work that ECR is doing, different campaigns that are ongoing, ways that you can support the people of Northeast Syria. So without further ado, I'd love to turn things over to Megan, but I'll start it off with a little introduction. Meghan Bodette is the Director of Research at the Kurdish Peace Institute. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University, where she concentrated in international law, institutions, and ethics. Her research focuses on Kurdish issues with a focus on human rights, peace, and democracy, women's rights, and Turkish cross-border military operations in Iraqi Kurdistan and northern Syria. She has briefed officials from governments and international institutions on her findings and has been interviewed by national media, including NPR and Now This, for her expertise. Further, I would like to just plug some of Megan's work. I will put in the chat here a link to her organization, the Kurdish Peace Institute, which we encourage everybody to check out, as well as her recent article, which is called The Next Step in Syrian Integration Must Be Constitutional Rights for All. It's a fantastic piece, which I really encourage people to check out. Here it is in the chat, in theory. There it is. And without further ado, Megan, welcome. Why don't you go ahead and just give us a little bit of context about what is happening in Northeast Syria and perhaps a little bit wider view of what is happening with the political process in northern Kurdistan, in Turkey, Bakur, and how these things might be interrelated.
Of course. Thank you so much and welcome everyone. Zor zor spas u hun b'khair hatin. As Arthur mentioned, I'm calling in from Kamishlo in northeast Syria right now. And this is a very critical time in these political processes. So it's a great time to be able to give an update. Now, as you probably know, if you've been following the situation in the region, almost exactly 1 year ago, the Syrian regime was toppled by military operations led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, and affiliated armed groups. And just over 1 year ago, it was publicly announced that the Turkish government was engaged in renewed peace talks with Abdullah Öcalan, the founder and leader of the PKK, who's been imprisoned in Turkey since 1999. And we have, in that interceding year, reached a stage where these negotiations have progressed quite significantly politically, but at the same time have not fully borne out results on the ground. So this is a period in which actors on all sides are now looking at the changes that they are going to make. Now, if we start with Syria, during the operations against the former Syrian state, from the beginning of that military campaign, HTS and the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Democratic Autonomous Administration in the Northeast were in communication. These groups that led the campaign against Assad were clear that they did not seek active armed conflict with the Autonomous Administration and the SDF. However, other members of their military coalition, the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army, took the renewed conflict in Syria as an occasion to ethnically cleanse the Shahba region, which was home to many Syrian Kurds, including many IDPs from Afrin, which was invaded and occupied by Turkey in 2018, and to threaten to cross the Euphrates River at Manbij and attack Kobani, one of the core areas of the Autonomous Administration and the Rojava Revolution. Now, ultimately, due to some quick international diplomacy and a real lack of, I think, appetite for further civil war at the time, there was a ceasefire reached with international mediation between the SDF and nominally the Turkish-backed groups, in reality with Turkey itself. And that ceasefire has largely held up since it was achieved in December of last year, in significant part due to civil resistance by the population of Northeast Syria at the Tishreen Dam, which is a strategic site along the Euphrates River where these militias were attempting to cross, where many people came and protested, in support of the SDF and the Autonomous Administration for months on end. So since then, with a few, small incidents, that ceasefire has held in place. And there's been no real change to the map of territorial control in Syria. Now, within the territory held by HTS, which quickly dissolved itself and formed the Syrian Transitional Government, you'll hear people refer to it as the STG, so that's what it is, the Transitional Government led by HTS. In the government's new territories, there was a very different picture, because while you had relative stability on the front lines with the SDF, and conditions in Northeast Syria didn't really change and have actually improved because of the ceasefire with Turkey. In government-held territory, there were two violent military campaigns against ethnic and religious minorities. So in March, there were attacks against Alawite majority areas in the context of clashes between, groups opposed to the new state and forces affiliated with HTS and the SNA, with these SNA militias being integrated into the new army. We saw reporting from Reuters that put a number of about 1,500 Alawite, mostly civilian casualties, and that suggested that these armed groups, including Islamist groups, Turkish-backed militias groups, very closely affiliated with the state, did take part in that violence. And then later in the year, in July, there were clashes in the Druze region of Suwaida in southern Syria. This region was already semi-autonomous, throughout much of the civil war. It regained much of that semi-autonomy, in the political transition. And this conflict was largely precipitated by government forces attempting to force their way in. Now, these two rounds of sectarian violence have been extremely damaging, for the Alawite and Druze communities and for the state building project of the transitional government as a whole. Because while during this period of time, They've been embarking on a very successful, in many ways, campaign to gain international support, recognition, and investment. These bouts of sectarian violence show that they either do not control the behavior of their armed forces, or they believe that targeting ethnic and religious minorities is acceptable behavior for their armed forces. So this has really shaken a lot of confidence in the capability of the new state and shown that there are very real threats to the Kurdish communities and other ethnic and religious minority communities that live in the Northeast if there were to be, renewed conflict. So at the same time, in this very fragile situation, in order to really protect the political and social gains that have been made in Northeast Syria, and to ensure that this type of violence does not repeat in the Northeast, the SDF and the Autonomous Administration have been engaging in diplomatic talks with the transitional government to find a way to peacefully reintegrate into the new state of Syria. In March, there was an agreement signed between the SDF and the transitional government that basically said, in effect, that the SDF and the Autonomous Administration would be integrated with the transitional government's institutions, and the new state of Syria would recognize the existence and rights of its Kurdish citizens. Now, in practice, the government almost immediately went back on that commitment, putting out a constitutional declaration that made no mention of Kurdish rights or existence at all, and actually repeated many Ba'athist-era policies of establishing only Arabic as an official language, naming the state itself as the Syrian Arab Republic, which erases not only the Kurdish population, but the many other non-Arab Syrian populations that have called Syria and that region home for centuries. So this immediately, shook a lot of people's confidence in this agreement. And then, of course, the ongoing sectarian violence further, I think, damaged that process. But it's important to note there have been no major attacks against Northeast Syria since the agreement was signed, and diplomatic engagements between the two parties have continued. And this is something that I think it's very important for people to understand. Damascus is not capable of waging war against Northeast Syria. It is not in their interests to do so when you look at what they're trying to get out of the international community. The instability it would create for them would negate a lot of the effort that they've been putting into attracting investment, trying to rebuild and consolidate their own power. So Northeast Syria has been able to establish itself as a political and military fact on the ground to a degree that it would be very damaging to both sides for conflict to break out. And I think that it's important that this be recognized. We're not in a situation where we're looking at imminent conflict beginning in this region. And so even with these, provocations and indications of, I think, chaos and a very sectarian attitude coming from the transitional government, negotiations have continued. And there was one incident of, brief clashes that actually, instead of escalating into further violence, seemed to remind negotiators and I think critically the international community of the urgency of getting to some type of deal. So about a month ago, in the beginning of October, clashes took place in the Sheikh Maqsood neighborhood of Aleppo, which is a Kurdish neighborhood that's been held by the YPG and the YPJ since very early on in the civil war, and that survived siege and attacks from both the previous Syrian regime forces and from Syrian opposition forces that now make up the current regime of Syria, that have taken over the Syrian state. So in early October, following road closures, blocking access to the neighborhood and blocking the transit of people, materials, there were civilian protests by local Kurdish residents, which armed forces affiliated with the transitional government attempted to violently disperse. And this escalated into a period of fighting between transitional government forces and the Autonomous Administration affiliated internal security forces. I forgot to mention, and it is important to mention, that one of the actual few diplomatic gains that followed the March 10th agreement was a specific agreement on the status of Sheikh Maksud in Aleppo specifically. So the YPG and YPJ left, the Asaish or internal security forces remained. They set up joint checkpoints with the traditional government, and they set up a roadmap for the neighborhood to maintain its institutions and build those institutions into the existing administration of the city. So there was an agreement in place here. And again, we saw that the transitional government, and in particular, the armed groups affiliated with Turkey that have been integrated into the new army, were not very serious about upholding their end of that agreement, and that led to conflict. But importantly, instead of escalating into the kind of large-scale ethno-sectarian clashes that have otherwise, stemmed from these kind of provocations in other parts of Syria, the fighting was over in less than 12 hours. Both sides quickly reached a ceasefire. And just the day after those clashes had taken place, there was an SDF autonomous administration delegation in Damascus meeting with the transitional government about the implementation of the March 10th integration deal. And I think that's very important because, again, this shows that the new state is not interested in picking a fight with the SDF and with the Northeast, even in the place where they are the weakest in Sheikh Maksud, where they control a neighborhood. They don't have, the territory or resources that they have in the wider Northeast. So again, I think that shows the degree to which, there is an understanding that the SDF and the autonomous administration cannot be dealt with as a security problem. And I think that that's very important. So since then, there's been some positive progress in the integration talks. We've heard from the SDF leadership that they've made agreements verbally in principle in the meetings to have the SDF be able to join the new army under a different name and structure, but in basically three blocks that will be divisions of the new army that will be active in the Northeast, as well as, I believe, 2 or 3 special units that might include the anti-terrorism forces, which are sort of the elite SDF units that have been engaged in the kind of very high-level counter-ISIS operations. And the YPJ, or the Women's Defense Units, is also in consideration to get its special status as well, which is something that is certainly not taken for granted in the negotiations when you look at the composition of the new state. So this has been very positive. It's been a long-standing demand from the Northeast Syria side to have the SDF able to integrate in a way where it keeps its structure and where critically people from Northeast Syria are responsible for security in Northeast Syria, right? Where we don't see these Turkish-backed militias, these foreign jihadists, these other unsavory characters that make up much of the new state's army, entering into areas where there are Kurdish populations. So this has been very positive. And I think we see today that in the aftermath of the meeting between Ahmed al-Shara, or Jolani, the new leader of Syria, former leader of HTS, and America's very own Donald Trump in the White House, it does not look like the US is giving a green light for further conflict. And if we look at the sort of strategy that the US has been pursuing here, of taking Syria, a longstanding Russian ally, and trying to take this change in government as an opportunity to bring it over to the US camp, and at the same time seeing it as very much an investment opportunity, not just for the United States, but specifically for the US president and the people around him. In order to do that, if we think about this from a very, pragmatic perspective and, kind of unfortunately take the morality out of it, they cannot invest and they cannot build a government that will be aligned with them if there is renewed civil war in Syria. because again, this is not a conflict that either side is capable of winning. And we know that if conflict does resume, we'll see regional states like Turkey and Israel grabbing up Syrian territory for themselves, as they've been doing, at previous stages in the war. We will see other regional and global powers, attempting to, regain some kind of status in Syria. It would be very quickly internationalized, any further conflict if it were to break out. And it would also scare away really any hope of investment and economic recovery, which is something that the new state has prioritized, particularly looking at their efforts on sanctions relief and things like that. So I think it's important to recognize that, again, there isn't an interest in the Northeast Syria issue being securitized and resolved by military means. And I think the positive messaging that's coming out of Northeast Syria right now about this meeting shows that, even with this renewed international engagement with the new Syrian state, that there's a view that negotiations are going to proceed positively, because it is not in the interest of any party for the transitional government to try and fail to take over the Northeast, and for further, destabilizing ethnic sectarian violence to be perpetrated by government forces. So overall, I think, this is a point in negotiations where it's time we might be looking at, actual changes on the ground. And there are still many unresolved questions. I think it's important, we've been talking a lot about security integration here, and the framework for security integration that's been floated is very positive in favor of the SDF and the Northeast, in giving them the presence in and control over security in, the areas where Kurdish communities live, and also influence, in the military and state structure of Syria as a whole. But these discussions haven't really touched on political integration. And while obviously, community control of security and the prevention of the entrance of HTS forces, SNA forces into the Northeast is a very important sort of prerequisite for any kind of self-governance, it's not the end of the story. And here, there are some very significant differences between the Northeast and the transitional government. And this is something, if anybody wants to look at the analysis that Arthur shared in the chat, that would be wonderful. But just on the level of the sort of basic political documents of both sides, for example, the Syrian Constitutional Declaration, as I said, recognizes only Arabic as an official language. In Northeast Syria, you have Kurdish, Arabic, and Aramaic as official languages, and further recognition of every language spoken by communities in Northeast Syria as a language that can be used in official business, and in particular, that can be used as a language of education. So all children, have the ability to go to school in the language that they speak at home, which is critical for language development and, for the rights of those kids and being able to learn in a language that they understand. In Northeast Syria, there's no establishment of religion. There's a very strong commitment to freedom of religion and religious diversity. You had, for the first time in Syrian history, for example, the Yazidi community being recognized as its own community in Northeast Syria under their social contract. Previously, under the old Syrian state, Yazidis were considered to be Muslims, which, is erasure of their identity. And the jihadist groups that, have made up a large portion of the opposition viewed Yazidis, because of their religious minority status, very negatively, persecuted them. And of course, we all know about the genocide committed by the Yazidis of Sinjar by ISIS. So this recognition and protection in Northeast Syria was something very unique. In the transitional government constitutional declaration, they establish religious tests for office. So they say that the president of Syria has to be a Muslim, which of course it's a Muslim majority country. You might argue it's very likely that the president of Syria will probably be a Muslim. But when you set the precedent of establishing a religious test for a public office, you're automatically granting one religious group status and prestige over others. And even more concerningly, it establishes Islamic law as the basis of, all jurisprudence in Syria itself, which again is common in the region. But when we see, laws like this implemented, it almost always leads to discrimination, both legally and socially, against non-Muslim religious minorities. So religious freedom is another huge difference. The rights of women kind of, related to the religious freedom issue as well. HTS, when they governed Idlib, imposed a very conservative framing of Islamic law on local populations in a way that led to, sort of religiously justified oppression of women. And then the Syrian state itself, and I think it's very important to understand that there's been a lot of continuity in the type of state that Syria is, was also very oppressive of women and, had very few women, in positions of actual power. So when you have this sort of authoritarian nationalist and Islamist convergence, you have a constitution that goes out of its way to not mention equality for women, instead talking about, their special status within the family and society, which is, language that's very often used to make that status second class. In Northeast Syria, I don't have to tell people here listening, women have achieved an incredibly high level of participation in politics, in self-defense, in public life. Their social contract explicitly mentions, the equality of women in all spheres of public and private life completely. So both, within the public institutions of the autonomous administration, but there's also a constitutional guarantee to equality, within families and communities, which is very important as well. So when we look at these kinds of differences, we see that these gaps are very difficult to bridge because people who are used to equality for women, religious freedom, the ability to speak their own language, aren't really interested in compromising and giving that up, right? There's no 50% or, 66.6%, whatever, 2/3 of the right to speak my language or the right to be an equal citizen as a woman. So these are some very serious divergences here. And the ideal way to resolve them, which would be some form of, community control of local government decentralization, is also a real sticking point in negotiations. Obviously, Northeast Syria is advocating for a decentralized Syria where, cities, towns, municipalities, regions within the country have control over their own security and over their own governance, in a way that puts as much power in the hands of local people as possible. And Damascus, I think it's important to remember, again, the continuity here. Syria has always been, a very centralized state, as a legacy of both British, French colonialism, European colonialism in the region, and a legacy of the kind of ultra hardline Arab nationalist politics of the Ba'ath Party. And it's in a neighborhood of very centralized states as well, again, owing to, those colonial roots and to the nature of the sort of hegemonic regional politics. And then HTS itself, this group that became the transitional government, coming from, origins as a jihadist group. This is also not a group that tolerates any kind of, decentralized rule or sort of pluralism at all. So when these two legacies of the type of state that Syria is and the type of group that HTS was merge, you have a sort of allergy to decentralization and to the idea that communities can organize themselves and determine their own destiny. But at the same time, there's an important contradiction here that is, shaping many of the dynamics of negotiations. The transitional government, as I've repeated here, understands that it does not have the military capability. It does not have the economic capability. It does not have the personnel. It cannot take over the entire Northeast and force it under the control of a centralized state in Damascus of its own accord. it's important to recognize here the transitional government does not fully control, all of the territory that is sort of shaded in green on the map, right? And then when you look at the territory that they don't yet have any control over at all, they simply don't have the capacity to put that under an ultra centralized system to the degree that they would like. And they're aware of this. I think, this is important to note. The obstacle to the acceptance of a decentralized system, which would sort of solve both sides' problems, right? Damascus doesn't have to cough up the money and personnel to take everything over. People in the Northeast don't have to be ruled by political systems and groups that, view them extremely adversarially. This could work for everyone, but from what we've been hearing, from my contacts with people on the ground here, is that the main obstacle has been Turkey. Turkey does not want to accept a decentralized system in Syria because it fears having to make those same kind of reforms at home. And so when I get into this last part of this introduction here, I think, this is a good segue into the political process in Turkey. As I mentioned, just over a year ago, we learned that renewed peace talks had begun between the PKK and the Turkish state. This is just the latest of many peace attempts since the 1990s, when Abdullah Öcalan declared the PKK's first ceasefire. All of these peace processes have attempted to achieve the same thing, which is, Kurdish rights recognition and democratic political participation, within the existing borders of Turkey itself. And, I think when people have been looking at this peace process, there's been a lot of concern. There's been a lot of fear that, too many concessions are being made too early. And I think that if you look at history and you see, the positions the Kurdish movement has taken, this idea that they're willing to accept, one democratic state, with the equal rights for Turkish people and Kurdish people, this is not new. This is something that Öcalan has been saying he's been willing to accept in negotiations since 1993. And even steps that have been taken subsequently. I believe everyone, is familiar with Öcalan's statement in February of this year calling for the disarmament and dissolution of the PKK. The PKK has dissolved itself before. It ended up refounding itself in 2004 and 2005 after the failure of the Turkish state to take steps towards, actually engaging in political reforms. But it has in the past dissolved itself in order to facilitate a political process. So this is not new either. This process of change within the organization is something that's happened many times over. And the willingness to abandon armed struggle as a tactic and engage in political struggle, again, this is something that's been floated in negotiations many, many times over. And I think we have to recognize that even, at this state today, where, the PKK, though having dissolved itself, still does exist organizationally, has not begun the process of disarmament yet. It still is an organization that has many more civilian members than armed members and engages in unarmed politics, to a degree equivalent to or even more significant than the degree to which it is engaged in an active armed conflict. Particularly when you look at the type of armed conflict that was being fought, for the past 20 years or so, the PKK has not been fighting for the control of territory. Obviously, in Iraq and Syria against ISIS, that was a bit of a different situation. They had the opportunity to take hold and govern territory. But the war within Turkey's borders, the conflict that is actually being ended right now, was being fought for the purpose of gaining political leverage in order to, impose conditions where gains could be made through negotiations or through other forms of politics. And I think the organization reached a point where, they decided that it was actually better for the political side of the Kurdish movement, that is engaged in legal politics through parliaments and municipalities, that is engaged in, politics sort of outside of formal legal structures through community organizing, at the neighborhood level, at the city level, in all the areas where Kurds live in Turkey. that these aspects of the movement would actually be stronger in an environment where there was not an armed conflict between the PKK and the government of Turkey on Turkish soil. So I think we have to remember here when we're looking at what the Kurdish movement has done over this past year, that these are not necessarily things it has not done before and been able to come back from, that there's a history here. And also that the armed conflict within Turkey is only one part of an armed and political struggle, that has been taking place across the Middle East in different capacities. And it's very important, I think, to recognize that this is only talking about Turkey. Turkish officials have said that Öcalan should call on the SDF to disband itself, that Kurds in Iran, inspired by Öcalan's ideas and the branch of the movement there, PJAK, should disarm. And Öcalan and the Kurdish movement have been very clear that these statements do not apply to other parts of Kurdistan. That the SDF is engaged in its own process, not to disarm, but to be the armed force, of Syria in the regions of northeast Syria where Kurds live, and that Iran is a different situation, altogether entirely. So that's important to recognize, I think. And in these negotiations, we've seen positive indicators, though again, we haven't gotten to the point of full legal and institutional changes. Compared to a year ago, Öcalan is now able himself, to communicate and engage in negotiations. Different parts of the movement are able to communicate and talk to each other in a way that they couldn't before. There have been no removals and replacements of Kurdish elected officials since Öcalan's statement in February of last year. So while they have not restored elected officials to their positions, they have stopped removing them from office. And in the past few weeks, we've also seen releases of Kurdish mayors from prison. We've seen cases dropped against Kurdish elected officials. And critically, we've seen developments in the case of Selahattin Demirtas, who's arguably, the most famous political prisoner from the legal side of Kurdish politics, that could lead to his release under the European Court of Human Rights decisions. So there have been improvements for, the kind of political environment for Kurdish parties. There have been many releases of political prisoners who, served decades in Turkish prisons, who are now, actually being let out. Laws are being implemented that had previously, the state had been violating in order to keep people in prison for a very long time. There is increased political capacity, for Kurdish parties in Turkey right now that is very important. And then critically, there is a ceasefire. We see this in northeast Syria right now. It is now safe in Kamishlo to go outside. People are not worried about, drone strikes on civilian infrastructure, on, people engaged in politics and self-defense in these areas. People are able to move around freely in a way that they haven't been for years. The ceasefire is also in place in Iraqi Kurdistan as well. There's been record low levels of military activity. Again, the drone strikes are not as much of a problem. So we've seen these improvements. But again, like in Syria, we're at a stage where it has to get to the point of actual changes being made. And the kind of changes that are being looked at in Turkey include things like a legal framework for PKK members to come down from the mountains and, reintegrate and participate in politics in Turkey. I think a lot of times, people are saying, oh, well, typically in peace processes, disarmament is the last stage. But it's important to note that in many of these peace processes that sort of form the model, the armed movement doesn't have a political party. The Kurdish movement in Turkey has Turkey's second largest opposition party, right? The Dem party, that pro-Kurdish political tradition, already exists and already has significant political power, that can really only be increased, I think, in this process. So there exists a framework into which people who are shifting away from armed struggle they don't have to found their own political party. They can move into an established political tradition. So I think that is something that makes this process different, that's important to recognize. And then, of course, on the horizon in Turkey are potential changes to the constitution, where, of course, obviously Erdogan wants to adjust the constitution to allow himself to run for president again, but he doesn't have enough votes to do that with his party, the AKP, and his allies, the MHP. He needs Kurdish votes, and it is really impossible to have the Dem party, the pro-Kurdish political movement, voting for a new constitution that doesn't make serious changes on Kurdish rights. So that is something that is on the table now as well. And I think I can end it here. I feel like I've given a good overview of where we are in negotiations. As a bottom line, the situation right now is not bad. There is stability. There is not active armed conflict. The Kurdish position in negotiations in both countries is strong. And we can expect to see, I think, some actual, critical developments in these processes in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you so, so much, Megan. That was a fantastic job of giving us a basic overview and then some of what is happening and condensing a very, very complicated situation into understandable terms. I want to make sure we have time to turn things over to the participants who have offered a lot of really fantastic questions that I think will make this conversation even richer. Before I do, I want to kind of ask you a sort of bridge question to sort of zoom us out. You've done a great job of sort of describing the nuts and bolts of what is really happening on the ground. What are the unanswered questions? What might we see moving into the future? And I'm wondering if you could actually answer a bit more of a sort of conceptual question around this question of like, what do we mean by integration? What is the difference between integration into the Syrian state and surrendering, the revolution, so to speak? Because I think it's safe to say a lot of, the attendees here tonight, a lot of the folks that, participate in and follow the work of ECR, we come to these spaces out of being inspired by the gains of the Rojava Revolution, inspired by these institutions and practices of self-governance, of self-defense at the grassroots level. And I think for some folks, it can be really difficult and challenging just conceptually to think about, what does it mean for the continuation of this revolution if and when some of the institutions of Northeast Syria become sort of officially recognized or integrated into the state. Of course, elephant in the room is that right, this political framework of democratic confederalism, which really undergirds the whole movement in Rojava, is very explicitly a non-state or even anti-state framework for governance. So, is that a paradox? How do you see this? And to kind of put a bow on it, I think like my question to you would be, could it not be true that as long as communities on the ground continue to be able to organize their own institutions of self-governance and their own institutions of self-defense, might this question of which institutions end up being recognized by the Syrian state be secondary moving into the future? Is that not what's most important? Is that the perspective of the movement on the ground? Anyway, that's an earful, but
Yeah,
any of your
absolutely.
thoughts
I
on
think
this? Thank you.
No, that's an extremely important question. And I think, one criticism that we hear a lot of here on the ground is that this process has not been conducted very transparently. So not just, the solidarity community, the Kurdish diaspora, but many people actually, in Kurdistan aren't very sure about what is going on because, as a strategic decision, in the conduct of this process, in order to I think make it politically easier for
You can leave it on the speaker.
they have sort of secrecy about how the process has been conducted is on one level, in some ways necessary for it to move forward. But on another level, it really does create a lot of uncertainty and concern, among the communities that are on the ground living through this, engaged in this. So that contradiction, really has been very important to understanding kind of how the process has moved forward. And I think, has created a lot of very legitimate, concerns and questions among, the communities engaged here. So it is important to address that. I think that the difference between integration and assimilation or capitulation is something that the Kurdish movement's ideas of democratic confederalism have addressed for a while. Because, as you said, and as we all know, if you're here on this call, it is a movement that is against this concept of the nation state. But the way that it tries to go about that is not by creating new borders or, changing necessarily those existing political formats. It's by overcoming the nation state, in the actual context on the ground of the communities where Kurds live. And now, what does overcoming the nation state looks like? It means that on one level, you try to transform the state, so it is not an obstacle against you, so that it is more democratic, so that there is political space, so that the people responsible for security where you are not people who are opposed to your existence, all of these things. And then at the same time, you strengthen society, community organizations, people's own level of engagement in everything from, legal politics to community organizing outside of state structures, to a degree where, people are able to solve their problems and, determine their future, regardless of kind of what the policy of the central government is doing. And so these two processes in parallel, create a situation where at the same time, you might have these existing borders of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria, but ideally where Kurdish communities within those borders, have organized themselves and, gained enough political freedom where those sort of structures aren't such impositions on their lives anymore. And I think that we can see examples of this in, the political organizing of the Kurdish movement in northern Kurdistan, within Turkey, where if you look during the last peace process, throughout the 2000s and 2010s, they created a level of political organization, when given the opportunity to by previous peace negotiations, they were able to build up both their capacity to engage, in legal politics within the Turkish system, but also the capacity to organize themselves and take advantage of, the sort of freedom and breathing space provided by their participation in that system. So in an HDP municipality, for example, you would on the one hand have, the elected mayor, the elected city council, which was a pro-Kurdish party, engaged in contesting electoral politics, within the limits of democracy, quote unquote, in Turkey. But because you had that, you had more space to then also have things like women's councils, councils of peoples and beliefs, bringing different religious communities together, community organizing that wasn't a part of the municipal structure of the state of Turkey, but that had space to exist because of, a certain level of democratic, political participation. And that in turn, created the actual social base from which that legal political participation, formal political participation could then exist. So you saw these two processes sort of working at the same time of trying to ease up state pressure and take advantages of opportunities there, insofar as that could be done, while also building community capacity. And I think that something like this is what Kurds and, the communities in Northeast Syria are looking for to an even more developed degree, because politically the conditions in northeast Syria are better than, conditions in Turkey for Kurds ever were. If we look at how integration is going to kind of keep revolutionary institutions alive, when, for example, the SDF merges into the army of the new Syrian state, on the one hand, that certainly is in many ways, a departure from and an ending of a certain phase of history where this was a, non-state community-based armed force, engaged in the defense, of the very communities that it came from. But at the same time, it means that the people providing security in Kobani or Kamishlo or Derik will be people from those cities who have the politics and the social views and the perspectives of the people who live there. It will mean that because they're now responsible for, being the Syrian state forces that are providing security, that means that Syrian state forces aren't going to go around, disrupting community meetings or telling people that they can't speak Kurdish, asking women why they're walking by themselves on the street, right? So you have allowed the state to come back. You have allowed the state to absorb, what was previously a revolutionary institution. But at the same time, if that institution is now sort of the representative of the state, of the government in that area, it means that the government is going to largely keep its hands off of, people's organizing and participation, right? If the autonomous administration institutions are integrated with state institutions, that could look very different from the type of state institutions that Syria has had in the past. Decentralization, it's a difficult conversation, but it is something that's on the table. We could see administrative divisions and, the powers of local government being very different. And what communities in Northeast Syria could do in that type of structure would be something similar to what the HDP, the Dem party now, has done in Turkey. If you hold the offices, if you control the politics, you can make sure that those politics, are not harming your community. You can then create space for other organizing to continue. I think one really interesting example of this can be found in how the women's movement is approaching a lot of these questions. You have, on the one hand, they've made their red lines and talks very clear. They want the YPJ to continue to exist in some form, to have a women's autonomous armed force. They're defending, women's equal participation. They're defending the co-chair system. They're defending equal rights for women, at the level of the Constitution. But at the same time, when you ask many women leaders here how they feel about integration, they're like, we were doing the work that we're doing for the freedom of women before we were ever a part of any government. And we will keep doing it, no longer, no matter who is the government here. They point out that for something like the women's movement, there's even an asset to not being, a formal part of the state, because it allows you to be more critical of the system overall. There's a level of flexibility there, and, returning to the origins, as a movement kind of outside of the system that doesn't have to deal with some of the contradictions that happen when you go into, formal security and governance. So I think overall, this idea that, it's integration, in the sense of taking some of the power away from the central government and holding onto it yourself, and not, capitulation to the central government. I think it's important to understand that, that is really what people are fighting for. And that is a feasible outcome for them to get. Again, the transitional government does not have the capacity to force capitulation on Northeast Syria. The only way that they could do it is if they got Turkey to go along with a military operation. And if you look at the political dynamics in Turkey, they have been invested in the peace process. They have their own reasons for not wanting to do that. That would destabilize the entire political process that has been taking place and lead to, I think, a very damaging level of conflict. So it's never for certain, but I do think that they can't count any longer on, the inevitability of that kind of military escalation as a tool against the Kurds. So, there's not, the transitional government doesn't at this point have the capacity to, and likely will not have the capacity to, force Northeast Syria to give up everything. And while it is a real concession and it is a real, I think, something that people can be concerned about, to have these institutions become part of the state, the way in which I think they aim to do so is in the sense that, they will be able to then take the pressure of the state off of the people of Northeast Syria and allow those communities to, govern and defend themselves to the highest degree possible. And then of course you have, like we've been discussing before, things like, equal constitutional rights, language rights, religious freedom. People are not going to give that up. That is not up for negotiation. Integration also means that you, a Kurdish citizen of Syria, have all of the same rights as a Sunni Arab citizen of Syria, right? So that equal citizenship, equal participation, that is a basic condition of all of these negotiations. That has been made very clear by the SDF and the Autonomous Administration. So yeah, I think that's how we can understand kind of this question here.
Thank you so much, Megan. That's we could talk about this for hours and hours, and I have so many questions myself for you, but I want to go ahead and transition to taking questions from the audience. It's great to see folks are very engaged and have a lot of great questions. So just for the sake of getting through as many of these as we can, let's try to, and I can jump in on some of them as well. So it's not on you, Megan, but let's try to sort of pick some straightforward ones and give some straightforward answers. The first that comes to mind here is a kind of a two-parter from Kim White. And the first part is the United States still supporting the Kurds in Rojava, and how? And the second is about what is the impact of Israel's attacks within Syria and Lebanon as well. Any thoughts on these questions, Megan?
I think, typically when people are referring to, US support for the Kurds, they're talking about the assistance to the SDF for the counter-ISIS mission. We remember October 2019, we've seen that doesn't always actually translate into support. But in terms of the security assistance, that is continuing. The latest congressional budget for 2026 does include, ongoing support to the SDF. And the US, I think, for the ulterior motives that I mentioned of trying to take Syria out of the Russian-Iranian alignment, bring it onto a US alignment, and the sort of personal interests of US leaders in investment in Syria, and the interests, of their allies in the Gulf, in, Arab states in the region, those interests need some level of stability and peace in order to take place. There's not a company that's going to start building, big projects in Damascus or Aleppo if they believe that the Syrian civil war is going to restart tomorrow. So for reasons that are very different from the reasons why we might want to see a successful, peaceful integration, I think that the US and other coalition countries also want to see a successful, peaceful integration, because they know what the SDF knows and what the STG knows, which is that a military conflict, aimed at recapturing the Northeast and forcing it back under Damascus's control would not actually lead to a restoration of, traditional centralized Syrian sovereignty, but would restart the civil war, give Turkey an opportunity to move in, give Israel an opportunity to move in, let the Russians and the Iranians, try to fight for their place back, really cause a lot of not just, chaos and suffering within Syria, but return to the sort of internationalized, protracted regional conflict that had been taking place before the fall of the regime. And I think that there are many interests, in avoiding that outcome. You know, from the US, from the part of the Europeans, the Gulf, you know, the only players that I think see something to be won in more conflict in Syria are the Israelis and to a lesser extent the Turks. We've seen Turkey backing off because of the process, you know, with the Kurdish movement. They've not abandoned their military presence in Syria, and they've certainly not abandoned, you know, the level of influence that they have over the Syrian state. You know, that influence has stretched to a point where you even hear, you know, reporting of Syrian leaders being kind of feeling restricted by, you know, Turkey's approach. But they have not tried to take more territory. They have not, you know, been engaged in active conflict with the SDF since the ceasefire. And then leading into the second question, Israel, you know, I think as a state, you know, they have seen that, you know, their escalation and aggression in the region, you know, has weakened Iran. They're looking for a path to being sort of the hegemonic power in the region, you know, similar to what Turkey is also looking for. They do not want to see any kind of, you know, functioning states kind of on their periphery, because that inhibits their ability to expand in the region and kind of project their own power. So they have an interest in chaos in Syria. You know, I think we see this in their approach to the previous Syrian state. We see this in their approach to the current Syrian state. They do not benefit from necessarily a situation where conflict in Syria has ended and where there is a sort of strong functioning country of Syria that is on their border. And that is, you know, dangerous to some degree, obviously, because, you know, any kind of further, you know, military escalation could precipitate conflict. There's been a lot of reporting of, you know, the threats to Syrian communities, you know, in the territory that Israel has moved into. At the same time, you know, the sort of competition between Israel, Turkey, and Iran in the region, when you have a multipolar system, when you have multiple states that are competing for hegemony, this, while it does make things very dangerous and unpredictable, it also creates opportunities because, you know, when these states feel as though their interests are threatened, they may feel as though they have to make new political agreements. We see this with Turkey's engagement in the peace process, right? You know, Turkey is concerned that in the event of conflict in the Middle East, that Israel or Iran might choose to support Kurds against Turkey. A lot of this is conspiracy theories, and obviously the Kurdish movement has its very significant differences with the type of systems that exist in Israel and Iran. But because of this competition, Turkey feels like it wants to get the Kurdish movement on side, so to speak. And so while this creates threats, it also does create opportunities at the same time. I think that overall, the approach that Syria is trying to take at this point, you know, is to not pick fights with neighboring countries. Similarly, you know, in terms of trying to establish like some level of internal security, they don't want to, I think, you know, they're looking at engaging, you know, with as many of these governments as possible. You know, they've been talking to Russia, they've been talking to Iran, they've been talking to Israel. And, you know, any level of diplomatic engagement with Syria, you know, we're going to see can strengthen the transitional government's position. But at the same time, you know, the more countries that want to engage, I think that the SDF has seen Syria's engagement, you know, with all of these regional countries as preferable to renewed civil war. So the SDF certainly doesn't want to see a situation where Israel attacks Syria, you know, where Turkey attacks Syria, where Iran or Russia tries to do something. The view here, you know, people are tired. That's also very important. No one wants to see more fighting. There's not public appetite for it either. And I think that's something that decision makers on all sides are thinking about as well.
Thank you, Megan. Just keeping things rolling here. I'm having to be a little bit choosy with folks' questions. Some folks were able to put in multiple questions, so thank you so much to everybody. From Gina Lennox of the Kurdish Lobby in Australia, we have a question about the educational system to kind of take this in another direction shortly. Megan, what are your thoughts on what needs to be done in order for the achievements of students in schools and universities in Northeast Syria to be recognized in both within Syria at large as well as internationally, assuming in the case of Rojava's universities?
Yeah, that's a very important question. I think this is something that, again, we hear a lot of critique of the autonomous administration for that, in all of these years of building an education system, there wasn't necessarily enough importance placed on getting that system recognized internationally. And while, it is important to note that there are a lot of opportunities internally within Northeast Syria for people who graduate from the local school system, yes, they can't take those degrees outside of Northeast Syria. And that is a real issue, that is very impactful on people's lives. Everyone wants their degree to be recognized. So I think that the administration could have and should have taken the accreditation issue more seriously. And some of the, I think, diaspora and foreign academics, who helped with that system didn't always put as much importance on that and didn't always necessarily use the connections that they had to make that a priority in the way that they could have either. And, this is a long discussion, but I think that that's a real criticism that does come up and that people are talking about here. The only way for it to be recognized is for, in this process of integration, for the government to grant recognition. And that is something that the autonomous administration is asking for. It's my understanding that any decentralization deal, they're going to demand, obviously, education in, students' first languages, allowing schools to operate in Kurdish and other, non-Arabic languages spoken in Syria. They're going to try to keep, the universities that they have established. And this will take technical expertise. This will take time. But it's ultimately a political question. And the way that this resolves now, for all of the criticisms that you can make of the past, is that, they're going to go to the negotiating table. They're going to ask for that recognition. And I think that it's very reasonable to expect that as part of any kind of deal, that will be something that the government will offer.
All right, taking this in yet another direction, we have a question from Haval Paul about the status of the Turkish occupied regions of Northeast Syria. In his words, any updates on what is happening in the last 3 to 6 months from the areas originally of the ANES that were stripped away, thinking of Afrin, Serikaniye, Girispi, etc. I might add to this any sort of projections for the future, question of whether or not this has been coming up explicitly in the ongoing negotiations, the future of Afrin, Serikaniye, etc. Which, for those who don't know, these regions have been under Turkish occupation since, going back 2018, 2019.
Yeah, so first of all, this is definitely coming up in negotiations. This is important for the administration. They were supposed to establish, I think, joint committees from both the transitional government and the autonomous administration to specifically address this issue. The March 10th agreement on, sort of outlining the integration deal does explicitly mention the return of all displaced Syrians to their homes. There hasn't been much progress. I don't believe that those committees were ever set up. But I know that this is something that, leaders have said is very important, and that does come up when they are engaging with their counterparts in the transitional government. There have been some positive developments in that people from Afrin have been able to start returning to their homes. I personally know, many people from Afrin whose families have gone back to check on their houses and properties. Right now is the olive harvest season, so a lot of people are going back to check on their olive groves, harvest the olives. And many of the people who were moved in by Turkey, in order to change demographics, displaced people from other parts of Syria, and even refugees from Turkey who were actually illegally deported from Turkey into Afrin, for the purpose of changing the region's demographics and kind of fulfilling the government's sort of xenophobic, promises on sending Syrian refugees back. These people can now go back to the parts of Syria that they are actually from. Since the fall of the regime, a lot of them have chosen to do that, which has created space for the original residents of Afrin to then, be able to return to their homes. And there are a lot of security challenges. People are coming back to houses. One thing that apparently has been going on is that when, these people who were moved in there after the occupation, when they leave, they've been stealing the windows and doors out of people's houses. Like, I don't know, what needs to go through your head, what situation you have to be in to be like, okay, I've been living in this stolen house. Now I can go back to my house. Let me steal the window. Like, what? It boggles the mind. So people are coming back and finding, properties in condition that is not really livable. There are still, Turkish-backed armed groups that have now been nominally integrated under the Ministry of Defense, but that retain their own command structures and really don't have any mechanism for accountability, that are still harassing Afrin residents, imposing fines and taxes and, essentially demanding money from civilians for all types of purposes. I know people who've gone back to visit their olive groves and, start harvesting olives who found that armed groups have taken some portion of their fields. And the level of accountability is, from what I've been hearing, essentially dependent on who the individual from the transitional government that you're talking to is. I heard one story of a family from Afrin who actually got a call from a member of the HTS General Security that, hey, someone's leaving your village and it looks like they're taking a bunch of the stuff out of your house. Now, they didn't arrest the person who was stealing from the house, but they had the courtesy to be like, hey, maybe if you have relatives in the village, get them over there to look at that and stop that, right? So there are some people who will try to help in some way, but then there are also people who do nothing. There are people who, allow these groups to continue to behave in a very damaging way. And, I think it's worth noting that the situation under the Turkish occupation was so bad that when people heard that it was HTS that was going to come in and replace the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army SNA groups, there was actually a level of optimism because the view was that while HTS were radical Islamists, at least they had a sense of law and order. They weren't randomly breaking into people's.
I'm not sure if we lost Megan. She isn't coming, Shlom, and I'm just double check in the chat. Okay, I do think that we lost Megan, and she may join again shortly, but anybody who spent time in Northeast Syria can tell you the electricity is not something to be taken for granted, so I'm sure it's no fault of her own. I'm going to go ahead and try to kind of take things from where she left off. And again, if she rejoins, that's great. But now this question of the future of the Turkish occupied regions is really an important one. I should say that I kind of combined this question with another question from a person who's out there named Hevrin Khader, who has also shared in the chat that they recently returned from a trip to Afrin. And a lot of the things that Megan's been mentioning, Hevrin also mentioned seeing themselves, things like Turkish-backed Arab militias setting up checkpoints, abuses, killings, the continued theft of olive groves. So these things continue to be ongoing, and I think it's safe to say at the end of the day, what's able to change on the ground, just like anywhere, is going to depend not just on the official agreements on paper, but whether or not, in the case of Afrin, security is controlled by the Kurdish majority communities themselves. If they do return, many I've spoken to personally say that they can't return and they won't feel safe returning in a long-term sense until security is controlled by the communities themselves. And of course, whether or not Afrin can return to anything like its sort of former state of being, for those who don't know, really sort of the heart and soul of the Rojava Revolution, a place where the level of community self-organization, the level of general politicization in society at the community level was really higher than anywhere else, going back, of course, to a decades-long history within the Kurdish movement. This is going to depend on whether people can return and whether they can rebuild and replicate these institutions and practices of self-governance. And all of that is impossible without controlling security as a community, of course. So we'll have to wait and see. Some more questions just to continue moving here. I am going to double check my other chats to see if I've heard from any updates from Megan, but I don't believe so. Yeah, I'm sure that the electricity just simply went out, which happens all the time. I'm grateful that we could get her for the time that we had. Another question is Damascus also scared? This is a question from Dominic. Is Damascus also scared about more demands from areas like Sueda for autonomy as well? I think it's safe to say yes. I mean, in a certain sense, we could see the violence against minority groups in the northwest against Alawite minorities, as well as the violence against Druze communities in the south that's been perpetuated over the last and really enabled by the new Syrian state over the last almost year, we can say. One way we can understand that is an attempt to assert control and discipline over communities that otherwise have historically and threaten to continue to exercise one or another form of autonomy. So what shape that's going to take is yet to be seen. But in the case of the Druze communities in Sweden, for example, they have their own political organizations and parties. They've formed their own militias. There has been a non-zero amount of support politically, at least, um, for these communities from the autonomous administration and the SDF. Again, what's going to play out in the future is really yet to be seen. That's going to depend on all of these moving pieces that Megan has been mentioning. All right, some more questions moving along, trying to juggle all this here. A question from Colin. Question is, I'm just going to read this one out. I guess what structurally would preserve the relatively egalitarian relationship between the current SDP, perhaps that's SDF, has within itself and between itself and their communities, if they are an institution within the power structure of a religious law-based hierarchical state? Like being from the community doesn't do anything to prevent domestic military abuses in the US, right? Okay, I'm gonna do my best to kind of interpret this question. I'm not entirely sure, and Colin, I apologize if I'm misunderstanding it, but I think this is getting at the question of how are we to expect meaningful autonomy on the ground to continue if the structures that control security, the structures that control governance are ultimately, if and when they become a part of a Syrian state, which is anything but democratic and pluralist and decentralized, right? And I think that this question comes down materially to put it super crudely, like whether or not communities are able to hold on to their own weapons and whether or not communities are able to hold on to their own institutions, right? And so whether or not some institutions become recognized by the Syrian state and therefore are technically, officially state institutions. Now they receive funding, recognition at the national level, etc. Versus sort of autonomous grassroots institutions is yet to be seen. That's going to be the result of the negotiations. I think that it's safe to say the approach of the movement, at least ideologically, and I think we see this playing out at the strategic level, um, is to see the self-organization of society itself as essential, of civil society, in other words. So maybe there's going to be institutions of governance in places like Kamishlo, for example, maybe at the city level, for example, or the larger regional level and what they call cantons, sort of like a provincial level, that are Syrian state institutions, say a year from now, if this process continues to move in the same direction. Maybe on paper, officially, as far as the Syrian federal state is concerned, um, you know, there's a mayor and it's elected by X, Y, and Z process, and there's a sort of canton governorship equivalent, and that's elected by X, Y, and Z process. But what matters is not just that, but whether or not people continue to organize the communes and the councils. And maybe all of that is not going to actually be recognized by, the government of Ahmed al-Sharaa and HTS. But that doesn't mean that they won't continue to exist. And we could see another way to think about this. We could see the institutions that we've come to know and love about the Rojava Revolution, right? Things like the commune, which during the revolution, during the past decade or so, have been officially recognized pieces of, what we call, in the largest sense, the autonomous administration. We could see them continuing on in practice, but under what we could call like a dual power form, right? So the Syrian state could change structure and certain institutions could take on a new name. But regardless of where those lines end up being drawn, what matters is that there's this other force, this bottom-up self-organization at the community level. And if it continues to have a high level of organization, um, in theory, it can exert pressure as a dual power. And some communities may continue to experience self-governance in much the same way, simply with sort of the names and the laws changing, if that makes sense. But anyway, all of this is basically conceptual until we see how it plays out on the ground. I do want to mention that there's recently been an official effort both within the autonomous administration in Northeast Syria, as well as sort of rhetorically, at least, in the sort of statements coming out of from Abdullah Öcalan and from the Kurdish Freedom Movement in Turkey and Bakur, kind of reiterating the importance of kind of renewing and reinvigorating the organization of the communes, right? The commune is basically the building block of democratic confederalism, of this political framework of building a stateless democracy through the strategy of community self-governance starting at the local level. And that base unit is the local commune at the level of the neighborhood and the village. And those of us who spend time in Northeast Syria can tell you that the status of the communes is something that is very mixed in Rojava. It looks different in different places. Their development has taken place in uneven ways. And there's a lot of challenges and shortcomings in that part of the work. And so I think that recent efforts to put more resources, material and human resources into getting the communities well organized at the base level, at the commune level. I think we can see that as a reflection of the movement's emphasis of the importance of that self-organization. And perhaps it's also a recognition that if we're going to move into a phase where the Syrian state is determining which institutions in Northeast Syria are officially legitimate or illegitimate, it'll be all the more important that we have a high level of self-organization. Just want to respect that we're getting to time here. It's about 5:30. I think we probably have time for one more question. I'll see what I can do. It's too bad that we lost Megan, but it's all good. Oh, Megan's trying to get back on. I'm glad I double checked. Let's see if we can let her in. We'll just take a moment here. We appreciate everybody's patience. Having live events with folks in Northeast Syria is like this. Okay. She may try to join again, but really appreciate everybody's patience. So some more questions. All right. Here's a great question from Deborah. How can we continue to engage with this conversation or ECR in general on Signal or in some other better or more secure channel? That's a great question. If you're interested in getting more involved in the Emergency Committee for Rojava, this is a great time to just take the chance to, I'll share some links with you all about the work that we do, how you can follow the work that we're doing and get more directly engaged. Um, and the easiest place to start is by going to defendrojava.org or sending us an email at info@defendrojava.org. We do have some discussion chats. So if you go ahead and send us an email with your name and your desire to join a discussion chat, just mention how you heard about us, and I'll be sure to plug you in as best I can. But we do have discussions on WhatsApp and on Signal, and we occasionally hold events like this where we can talk with each other about what's going on. So again, juggling the chats here. Here's some links you'll see here in the chat to go into our website. We have social media everywhere you can find us basically at defendrojava.org. We have a YouTube channel as well. So if you were just joining us in the middle of the event, you want to see the rest of it, or if you'd love to share this event with friends you know who would be interested but weren't able to join us, we will be posting it up on our YouTube channel. So go ahead and follow our links there. I'm going to take one more question and then we will kind of transition to next steps, how folks can get more involved, etc. All right. Well, okay, Alexander has a question about uh, chatter on Twitter about HTS foreign fighters having been leaving the country recently. I can't speak to that. I'm not sure if that's happening. Um, that's a great question. Of course, it's important. Megan sort of touched on this, but it's important for people to understand, right, that just as you know, ISIS was a military political force that invited internationalists to join its ranks from around the world. Um, Other sort of offshoots from Al-Qaeda's lineage, which includes HTS very much, which of course grew out of a group called Jabhat al-Nusra, also have many foreign fighters in their ranks. And of course, it's also been documented that HDS and al-Nusra have had former ISIS fighters join their ranks after 2019 when ISIS lost its territory. One more question. Okay, one of the less controversial areas that Rojava may be able to expand its influence, perspective, and support across the country is its communal management of ecological restoration and reforestation. In the negotiation, is there anything being done to expand this sort of co-management outside of the region that sneaks in Rojavan values? I take this to be a question about whether or not Rojava is influencing approaches to ecological, like land management outside of northeast Syria. That's a great question. I don't know if that has come up yet. My gut tells me that because of the high stakes of these huge fundamental questions around security, integration, political governance, cultural rights, women's rights, etc., that questions of land management have probably not featured as prominently in the negotiations so far. The closest thing I can think of is that I know that the question of energy and resource sharing has certainly come up, but I think probably the form that it's taking is not about sort of methods of management, but more kind of about who's going to control what, right? Who's going to manage the dams, for example? who is going to have the right to um, oil that is extracted from the ground or any revenue that's gained from the selling of that oil within or outside of Syria, etc. But I think it's a great observation, Colin, that this is something that could very much be a part of the conversation moving forward. And hopefully if there's a peaceful, positive integration that does take place that allows for the gains of the revolution to be maintained and allows for some bare minimum of a peaceful coexistence between the country's diverse peoples to sort of go on, that yeah, maybe in the longer term, this could also, avoiding a war would also have these secondary benefits of exposing the rest of Syria to some of these ideas from the Kurdish freedom movement, from the autonomous administration that could be relevant in other spheres of life that are not just questions of military and politics. I think I will leave it there as far as questions are concerned. I really appreciate everybody's time for coming out. Appreciate Megan's time. I'll follow up with her offline here, but as we said, the reliability of electricity and internet in Northeast Syria can be a tricky thing. I want to share a couple other things as we move forward. One is that we have an exciting event coming up on the 29th that I really want to encourage folks to check out and RSVP for. We kind of have a save the date here where you can RSVP for the Zoom event by following the link I just shared in the chat. This event is going to be kind of a hybrid event. Celebrating kind of the end of the year. And we're inviting on a friend of ours, Matt Broomfield, who recently authored a book called Hope Without Hope, which is a very inspiring, well-written kind of meditation, if you will, on the lessons of the Rojava Revolution for movements around the world, and specifically around this question of revolutionary commitment to hope in a hopeless world, as he says, which I think could be very relevant to many of us. So Matt's going to come on. He's going to give a presentation about his work, and we're going to open up like an open group discussion about the content of his book. And we're also going to be sharing some exciting updates about the work that ECR is continuing, how people can get involved, different ways people can show their solidarity with the Rojava Revolution, as well as support the work that we ECR are continuing to do. I also want to plug a recent campaign that has been launched by the women's movement in Northeast Syria. For those of you who don't know, there's a federation of women in Northeast Syria called Kongra Star. And this campaign they've just launched is titled, in traditional Rojavan fashion, "With the unity of women, we build a free, democratic, and decentralized Syria." So as you can imagine, the main thrust of this campaign is to raise awareness about how inseparable the freedom of women and the future of Syria as a country are. In other words, society cannot be liberated without women being liberated and cultural minorities being liberated. So the folks at Congress Star, they have a kind of web page together where they are sharing the themes of this campaign, and the main thrust of it is an effort to ask people around the world, especially women, I should add, especially women, for obvious reasons, to record short videos of solidarity and send them to Congress Star. And Congress Star has been assembling these messages of solidarity into kind of compilation videos to really demonstrate widespread global support for the women of Northeast Syria, and again for the movement continuing to push for women's rights and minority rights to be central to these negotiations, central to any future constitution for the country of Syria. And lastly, for those who haven't heard, as we mentioned at the top of the event, Ahmed al-Shara, the new president of Syria, recently visited Washington, D.C. the United States is normalizing, moving towards normalizing relations with the new Syrian government. And while that brings potentially positive things like the lifting of sanctions, um, it also brings with it serious questions and concerns about how the United States may influence the shape the country takes. And central to this question, as we're mentioning, is this question of cultural rights, of political rights, of women's rights, whether or not, as we've been talking about all night here, the people of Northeast Syria are going to be able to continue to have their institutions of self-defense and self-governance be recognized at the local and regional level. And so what we're sharing here in the chat is the contact information for the Senate Foreign Relations Chair, Mr. James Reich, who is a Republican from Idaho. He is sort of the head foreign relations member in the U.S. Senate. We have his phone, we have his email here, and we, as counterintuitive as it may seem, as cynical as we may all feel these days about our ability to influence the federal government, because the stakes are so high and because the communities in Northeast Syria have been asking for this kind of support. We want to extend the call to all of you and ask you to take a little bit of time, go ahead and copy paste, if you will, this little prompt and the contact information. And please take a minute to call this number, leave a message, send an email to the office of James Reich, and let it be known that there are indeed people who care deeply about the future of Northeast Syria. And let it be known that there is grassroots pressure on the federal government to try to ensure that, to put it bluntly, that Trump doesn't sell out the Kurds again. So it may not feel like the most sexy or exciting thing to do with your time. It may not feel like the most hopeful thing to do with your time, but we do encourage you to do it because, as we say, the friends are asking for this help. And I think it's worth just a few minutes out of your time. So thank you all so much. We really appreciate your time. Again, be sure to reach out to us at info@defendrojava.org if you want to get involved in any of our chats or learn more about upcoming events or opportunities. And without further ado, I would just say, Serkeftin, as they say, Chef Bosch, good evening. And thanks again. Love and solidarity to all of you. Thanks, everybody. And yes, of course, if we didn't have time to get to your question, and I apologize if that was the case for you, feel free to shoot us an email with it. We'll do our best to reply to you. It's really important to us to keep this conversation going, and so it's fantastic to have more questions than we can get to because it means we can keep the conversation going. So again, all the best. Take good care.